All right. Wow. What a crowd. Love regulations. But first, although I'm not Swedish, I will do the Swedish way and we will start with some safety instructions. The permits have a voice-guided evacuation alarm. Therefore, leave the premises, of course, in case there is a problem, immediately when you are prompted to do so. The premises have 2 emergency exits. Look around. And the closest one might be right behind you. In case of an emergency, there is a defibrillator, which I always have problems to pronounce, in the lobby and here next to the stage. Now, today, we will have now a session about the EU Green Claims Directive and related to sustainability regulations. Let's just be clear that this session is a little bit more of an informative session by 2 legal experts on the matter. Please take their advices not as a formal legal advice, but rather guidance and awareness on these topics that we believe should be more accessible to all of us that attend the conference. After hearing from Benedicte and Baptiste, we'll have a Q&A session with them, and we can learn and you are able to ask more questions about the EU Green Claims Directive and related sustainability regulations. Now, many of you know me. I didn't introduce myself. Roy Ariel, the General Manager of GSTC. But while I am hosting this session, we prefer not to answer questions directed at GSTC, but rather ask you to utilize the time, the precious time that we have with the 2 experts, and ask them about the new regulations. So, without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, who will join us through Zoom. Benedicte van Ormelingen, Legal and Policy Officer, Consumer Directorate at the European Commission. Working in the Directorate General for Justice and Consumers of the European Commission, Benedicte is responsible for the directive on empowering consumers for the green transition and working on policies linked to sustainable consumption. Prior to her current position, she worked in the Cabinet of Commissioner for Justice Reynards and also served as a member in the cabinet offices at Belgian federal level in Washington, D.C., USA, as well as an associate at the U.S. law firm Cleary Gottlieb's in Brussels. Benedicte, the screen is all yours.
Thank you very much, Roy. Good afternoon to all. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and I'm thankful for the opportunity to present you 2 EU legislative initiatives, the Directive on Empowering Consumer for the Green Transition and the Green Claim Proposal. I will be very happy as well to exchange and to answer questions today, and also potentially, if necessary, to follow up after today. So on the first slide, I wanted first to give you a bit of political context. I'm sure so that you all know the European Green Deal, which sets out a comprehensive strategy to transform the EU into a green economy, and then call also to review all EU policy to make them fit for the green transition. And so the European Green Deal highlights that consumer policy will help to empower consumers to make informed choice and play an active role in the green transition. And so, subsequently, in 2020, the Circular Economy Action Plan and the new Consumer Agenda were adopted. And this communication sets out and foresee a number of complementary and reinforcing each other initiatives. And so the 2 directives that I will present you today, the Empowering Consumer for the Green Transition and the Green Claims Directive, are actually part of a broader package of legislative initiatives that aims to ensure a more sustainable production and a more sustainable consumption. And so, for example, I'm sure you heard about the Eco-Design for Sustainable Product Regulation, which ensures that products are sustainable by design, and also the Right to Repair initiative that aims to promote repair in the after-sale context. And both this proposal actually have been adopted yesterday by the plenary of the European Parliament, and so both of these legal acts will be published in the coming weeks in the official journal and enter into force. Then on the next slide, so now back to maybe our first directive that I will present you today is the new directive on empowering consumer for the green transition. And the goal of this directive is really to provide better information to consumer on durability and reparability, and to find two types of misleading commercial practices, greenwashing and early obsolescence. Here we do have already a directive that has been published and entered into force on the 27th of March 2024. And so now member states will have 2 years to transpose the directive, and then there will be an additional 6-month period for all the actors to adapt before it enters into application the 27th of September 2026. And so this directive is it's not a standalone new directive. Actually, we are amending 2 existing consumer laws, the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive and the Consumer Rights Directive. They have what we call a horizontal safety net approach. It means that they apply as long as there are no more specific rule in specific sector that applies. So it's really a safety net, and then if there are more specific rules, then this specific rule will apply. Maybe one important point is that because we are amending existing directive, we are not changing the scope of this directive or the general way and logic of intervention. We are like just adding targeted amendment to ensure that this consumer law is actually fits for the green transition. So, for example, we are not changing the scope of these 2 Unfair Commercial Practice Directive and Consumer Rights Directive. So the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive that we call the UCPD applies to commercial practices from traders towards EU consumer, and the Consumer Rights Directive apply to contract between a trader and an EU consumer. On the next slide, please. So here I will dive a bit more into the specific new provision, and I will try to take more time on the one that I believe might be of most interest to you. So one of the 2 goals of the directive is to fight misleading commercial practices amounting to greenwashing and early obsolescence. The Unfair Commercial Practice Directive so targets business to consumer commercial practices, and it is already currently used to address greenwashing or early obsolescence practice. But the amendment will introduce like more specific rules and prohibition, including what we call the blacklists in the UCPD, meaning practices that are prohibited under all circumstances. And so this will ensure more clarity and also will facilitate enforcement against the most frequent and identified problematic practice linked to greenwashing and early obsolescence. So on greenwashing, we are introducing 2 new types of prohibition, some in the general part of the UCPD, and for this it will require still a case-by-case assessment whether it had an impact on the consumer decision or not. And here, for example, environmental and social characteristic and circularity aspect are explicitly included among the main characteristics of product on which consumer should not be misled. We also have a new provision on claims related to future environmental performance. We see that this kind of claim are increasingly made. And so, for example, a company claiming that they will reduce their emission by a certain percentage by a certain date, for example, 2040. And so The directive only allows such commitment if they are clear and verifiable, underpinned by a detailed and realistic implementation plan that will be then verified by a third-party expert. And this should ensure that the commitments are meaningful, trustworthy, transparent, and then that they are adjusted in case the company will not be longer on track. Then there are also prohibitions that will be added to this annex one, the blacklist, so practices that will be prohibited in all circumstances. And here again, I will give you a few examples. There is a prohibition of generic or vague environmental claim without proof of recognized excellent environmental performance relevant to the claim. So it means that it's not possible anymore to claim for a company or a product that it's green, environmentally friendly, nature friendly, if it cannot be demonstrated this excellent environmental performance. And this will to a large extent solve many problematic practices that we see happening on the market, where like actually consumers do not understand exactly what the claim relates to. Then there is also a new prohibition on claims based on greenhouse gas emission offsetting scheme. So companies can no longer claim that their products are climate neutral, climate positive, or have a reduced climate impacts based on carbon offsetting project outside the product's value chain. So a classical example would be of offsetting project would be planting trees in a third country that is unrelated with the business. And just to clarify, so this prohibition relates to claim on products. Claims at company level are not covered, and of course also trader will still be encouraged, allowed to do any type of claims linked to reduction in their own, of course, operation or reduction of greenhouse gas emission in their own value chain. But let me dive a bit more into one prohibition that probably will also be of interest to you. It's on the next slide on sustainability labels. So there is a specific ban on displaying a sustainability label that's not based on a certification scheme or not established by public authority. And by certification schemes, it is meant a third-party verification schemes, and the term of which will have to be publicly available. On the next slide, you will see as well some more specific criteria that would need to be present. So the scheme is open under transparent, fair, and non-discriminatory terms to all traders willing able to comply with the scheme requirement. The requirements also have to be developed in consultation with relevant experts and stakeholders. The schemes needs to have procedure to deal with non-compliance. And also the last point, there will need to be a monitoring of traders' compliance with the requirement. And this needs to be done by a third party, which is competent and also independent from the scheme owner and the trader. Then there will also be a few new prohibitions in the UCPD about relating to early obsolescence, because this practice, of course, are causing first consumer detriments, but they also have a negative impact on the environment in form of increased waste, increased use of energy and materials. And so the directive is not banning the design of such product directly, because this is beyond the scope, but really addressing misleading commercial practices to avoid that consumer receive this misleading information and make sure that they can make an informed choice. And an example of a few bans that we introduced is false claim on durability and reparability. For example, presenting a good as reparable when it is not, or claiming that a good will last a certain amount of time under normal condition of use when it is not the case. And then maybe the last part on the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive, the next slide, thank you very much. And here it's in the Consumer Rights Directive. Currently, this directive requires that sellers provide consumer with information at the point of sales about the main characteristic of the product prior the purchase. And so the amendment will introduce some more specific requirements with better information regarding sustainability aspects, both online and offline. And so, for example, there will be a new harmonized label that will be shown to consumer if the producer is providing some type of commitment that its product will last for a certain amount of time, and that if it's not the case, the consumer will be able to replace it or repair it. So under certain condition, then a harmonized label at EU level will be displayed so that consumer know that the product lasts, it has a commitment that the product lasts longer. There will be also new reinforced information about the existence of the legal guarantee, also on repair and the availability of spare part repair, maintenance of a repair score, and also about a minimum period during which a consumer can expect software updates to be provided by the producer. Let's move now to the next slide and to the Green Claims Directive proposal. So here, let me first insist of the status, because this directive is not final yet and it's still under negotiation. So that's why also I will go less into the details of this directive. The proposal was adopted by the Commission in March 2023. It's still being discussed by the co-legislators. So the European Parliament has adopted its position in March 2024. And now the Council is aiming to reach a general approach at the end of the Belgian presidency, so in June 2024. But so I will present you briefly the main element of the Commission proposal, knowing that, of course, this proposal will be amended by the co-legislators. So the proposal is a standalone directive, a new directive. The objective is really to protect consumers, but also companies from greenwashing, and so enable consumers to take informed purchasing decision. And so it's really complements the horizontal consumer law and the UCPD that I just presented you. Another objective is to improve legal certainty, boost the competitiveness of companies that are truly more sustainable, increase also credibility of green claims, and accelerate the green transition. The scope of this proposal so targets explicit claims so that are made on a voluntary basis by businesses towards EU consumers on environmental impact, aspect of performance of a product or the trader itself, and for which there is no other EU rules on substantiating or communicating claims that are in place in specific sectors. So it's also a general framework that can be supplemented or replaced by more specific legislation in specific sectors. So, for example, an example of claims that will be targeted by the proposal will be like product made of 30% of recycled materials. The proposal also addresses environmental eco-labeling schemes. And then, I see you are already on the next slide, very good. So here are very briefly the key elements that are introduced by the new Green Claims Directive. So there will be no requirement on how to substantiate and communicate an environmental claim. So just to give you an example of requirement that have been proposed in the Green Claims Directive is that claims can only be made if they are based on an assessment relying on widely recognized scientific evidence, proving that the environmental benefits are significant, or again, identifying trade-offs between environmental impact, also, of course, based on a life cycle approach. There will be also new rules for environmental labeling scheme, ensuring that they are reliable, transparent, third-party verified, and regularly reviewed. And this is in line with the empowering consumer for the Green Transition Directive that I just described to you. There are also a few other additional bans. For example, a ban on labels presenting aggregate scoring of overall impact, so all environmental different impacts, unless they are specifically included in union rules. There is also, and this is in view to avoid proliferation of label. So there is a ban of new establishment of new public scheme on national and regional level. And also by introducing an approval process for new private schemes and new public schemes from third country that will need to demonstrate the added value of those schemes already present on the market. Just to let you know that this is widely discussed by the co-legislators, so probably the final outcome will be amended. And then lastly, but quite importantly, the Green Claims proposal foresee a pre-approval of all claims and label scheme by independent and accredited verifiers. So before any claims or label can be communicated to EU consumer, they will need to go through a pre-approval process. So that's the main element I wanted to present you today, but happy to enter and to discuss and to answer to your question at a later stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Benedicte. I think we will stop now to show you while we go to hear from Baptiste, and then you'll join us again for the Q&A. So just stay with us in a moment. Baptiste Carriere-Pradal, co-founder and director of 2B Policy. He is experienced in sustainability and policy development. As a senior advisor at the Boston Consulting Group, Baptiste provides support on matters pertaining to the EU sustainability legislation. He is also the co-founder and director of 2B Policy, where he spearheads initiatives to integrate legislative discussions into business decisions. Baptiste.
Thank you. Good afternoon, all of you. So I'm very happy to be here with you today. So for the next 15 minutes to the most, I will try to complement what Benedicte has said regarding the content of the two pieces of legislation to allow for a maximum question that we can have after during the Q&A session. The first point to say is that indeed, as Benedicte also outlined, the main point I will make regarding the Green Claims Directives are based on a text which is still under discussion, even though we know approximately a good chunk that will go forward. I also want to make a disclaimer, I'm just a messenger. So what I will say sometime might be complicated. I may not say things that you may want to hear, and you may sometime even be a bit upset. But again, I'm just the messenger in the here. There is an entire process in the European Commission with the Parliament, the Council to create the legislation. But it's important to keep in mind that when talking about this file, to again have a bit of an idea of the magnitude of what we talk about, when the European Commission made an assessment about why it is relevant to regulate green claim today, is because for their own assessment, today, more than 50% of the claims and labels made to the European consumer are misleading. 50%. In my assessment, looking at the legislation, this is grossly underestimated. So it's much higher than 50%, because the legislation, as presented by Benedicte, will be very demanding. There is a lot of points which are changing. So again, we'll take that step by step. We'll start to mention some highlights. It could be an entire hours to dive into every piece of legislation. Benedicte has already extracted some points of the legislation that are very material. So here is really to give you again another flavor of some more points that are important. And as mentioned, so within my organization, we support different organizations to do this trajectory. We've been working with Cradle to Cradle or others to exactly anticipate what's coming up and how one can ready itself in view of legislation. So if we move to the next slide, sorry, I have the clicker actually. So if we move to the next slide, let's start by the very beginning, that any claim moving forward will have to be very clear, specific, and avoiding overstatements. We come back to the very basic idea. Benedicte, as she mentioned, as per the new piece of legislation, we don't want anymore, or the European Commission doesn't want anymore very vague thing. This is green, sustainable, this is environmentally friendly. This time is gone. So now whatever is claimed has to be very clear. It has to be understandable by the European consumer. I make one point here. Always important, I still want to double click on that. We talk here about claims which are made business to consumer. B2B is out of the conversation. So it's purely business to consumer. But even if you are not based in the European Commission or the European market, sorry, the moment you addresses a European consumer, then you fall under this legislation. So it's very important to have also that in mind. So coming back to the point, the moment you address a European consumer, then you have to make sure that you are very clear in what you say. Nothing should be exaggerated. It has to be, again, no overstatement and very specific. Because the idea is to be able to ensure that whatever you say is factual. It's factual based on facts. Facts are made of figures very often. And this morning, the General Director of the GSTP was very candidly saying that there is already an issue of figures and measurement in the industry. Hence, I come back to my statement of 50%. Because ultimately, in the background of all of that, even if, as Benedicte already mentioned, there is no clear mention of you have to measure like this, the list of the requirements the Commission has to consider that your measurement is valid, is robust, is long and demanding. So it's important to have those elements in mind while doing this work to ensure that, again, there is no overstatement. You just have a certificate, you just have a label that says what it is, that it's clear, and that it's specific. And I will come back on this point in a few minutes. The idea also is to make sure that whatever you say has to be reliable, is based on reliable information. We come here on the fact of sometimes there can be some self-declaration, there can be a couple of elements like that. So here we have to base that everything has to be verifiable in the substantiation. I will come back on all of the verification requirements that are in the background, both at the level of the certification scheme itself and of the label which is then given. But therefore, that means that there is a very big need in the background to have very robust data in order to be able to make your claim. The claim that you make has to be relevant from a service perspective. What does that mean to be relevant from a service perspective? Which impact are the most relevant when you talk about the service you are providing or the experience you are providing? There is science to evaluate that. The example sometimes I take is that if you go to the supermarket in Sweden here or whatever, and if you buy a bit of can of tuna for your lunch, for your sandwich, there is a beautiful label that shows you a dolphin and it tells you no dolphin has been killed while catching this tuna. Maybe the information is very good and I have all of my respect for all dolphin lovers. But the key thing is that is it actually the most important impact when you catch a tuna not to kill fish, not to kill a dolphin? Is it the most important things? What about the carbon impact of this kind of tuna? What about the footprint on other species that have been killed in the process? It doesn't say anything. Hence, is it relevant from an impact perspective? No. Hence, it's greenwashing. So that's exactly this type of step that you have to think about. One can say the same for many other. I could take my notebook. There is a beautiful label which tells me that the paper from this process come from a forest that ensure that there is no destruction of forest land, and that is from a plantation. Very important topic. But is it actually the most important impact in making wood? I'm not sure. So same comes from every label which is there. Is the impact, the most material impact we talk about, included in your label, in your scheme? And can you prove it scientifically? Benedicte mentioned from a life cycle perspective. There is not yet a clear method formalized. That will be yet another topic. It will come. The Commission is actually working on it to be able to measure the impact. But yet there is processes and indication to say which are the most material impact that we should talk about when we talk about one night in a hotel, when we talk about flying on a plane, or going on a ski resort, or going on a golf resort. So those are the points which are important. And coming back to, those have to be very specific to the particular product. If again you identify that you have measures all of the most important impact, and you want to talk about those, and you want to start to talk, the one you bring to the consumer has to be relevant to the most important impact. Which means again that in the background needs to be a lot of work to be able to have a beautiful picture about what are the most relevant impact, do I measure them, and am I able to communicate that fair and square to the consumers to get a fair appreciation of the service that I'm selling. So there is a very good idea that whatever should be communicated has to be robust, has to consider all of the full impact and the most material one, and therefore ultimately concentrates on what matters. Then now I come back on the verification element a bit. I come back here. Because there is a big point, sorry, you will take the pictures after, but there is a big point here that I still want to outline. What does that mean that by default to be specific on therefore what is not part of something that will be considered a valid point for a label? First, there is a clear provision that says that if you talk about compliance with local regulation, we don't care. You cannot take any advantage by saying that I ensure that the product or the service I sell meets the local regulation. It's considered to be a fact, so therefore any point like that is irrelevant. I come from Netherlands. There is a beautiful brand of chocolate called Tony Chocolonely. Some people may know about it. They praise themselves to be child labor free. It's a very valid statement, but it's greenwashing. Because one should expect that there should be no child labor because it's already a law in the country where the cocoa is created. So you should not bring this information to the public. Not in this way. That should not be an argument for sale to distinguish yourself from the consumers, from the competition, because then you indirectly imply that the competition has it. So that's one point. And then that means that I come back to my data that you reward a status. You don't reward a progress. So every question linked to do you measure and improve, that can be very interesting, but that's not valid for consumer information. To consumer, you certify an achievement, not a pathway. So that's a very important point. There is a lot of points, and I will come back on that again. That will take me the entire afternoon about you have to prove that the service has a better footprint than the average service that you are comparing it with. So that means again to know a bit the average impact of the service. Don't shoot the messenger. Then I come back to the verification element. The verification element is another point that is very important. There will be multiple verification that were already discussed by Benedicte. There will be a verification happening from the labeling scheme itself. In this sense that in the process, there will be also a before and an after. I will come back on that later. Meaning that the type of requirement that you will have if you already exist today, the 24th of April 2024, will be slightly different than the requirement you will have once the law is passed. Because there is two ambitions of the law. First, to drastically limit the number of labels already existing and to prevent too many new ones happening. Benedicte rightfully mentioned to avoid proliferation of labeling schemes. So that means that what you will have to have is that first somebody, a member state, will have to confirm that your labeling scheme meets the expectation of this directive. And then you will be on an official list of the European Commission who says this label, in terms of its requirement, don't come back. Benedicte started to mention about governance, that there is a lot of elements inside it. All of those meets the requirement of the directive. And then after, there will be a verification happening on the service itself, on the hotel, on the accommodation, on whatever, that this service itself meets the requirement of the label, which itself is certified. The label itself will be verified by the public authority, but when it comes to giving a label to a given hotel or accommodation, then it will be done by verifiers, which are accredited according to a system which is established by the law. Again, the director mentioned it this morning, difference of accreditation. In this case, there will be an official list of body who can do the verification according to the requirement. And then there will be a validation. Of course, the verifier must be independent from both the trader and the certification scheme, which is not always the case. Therefore, I will go briefly, but to tell you, normally, I just want to come to a point about what are the processes that one should do in order to go towards compliance. Because still something to have in mind, you are good in time. We are now in 2024. The legislation, there is two pieces of legislation. The consumer empowerment will be enacted in 26. That's in 2 years. The Green Claim Directive will come in implementation even later. But yet, the scale of the change will require years, because there is a lot of things that need to happen. The first thing that need to happen, and I still want to drive your attention to that, it was quickly mentioned by Benedicte, is the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive, UCPD. Who's familiar with the UCPD in the room? Thank you. That's account for, yeah, even more you, so okay. So this accounts for roughly 0.5% of the room. Keep in mind that as we speak today, KLM, Lufthansa, Booking.com, many others have already been accused of greenwashing. H&M, Decathlon, many others. The law that Benedicte presents are not yet applicable today, meaning there is today laws that technically allow jurisdiction to say you or you are greenwashing. It's the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive. This practice has a beautiful 100 pages guidance document, which just happened to have been updated in 2021. And actually is this piece of legislation that already says a lot of things that I'm saying today. It takes a lot of time to explain. It's not exactly the same legal weight. One is a guidance, one is a law. But yet today, when somebody wants to do an analysis of the situation, the starting point is always to think, compared to the today Unfair Commercial Practice Directive, how do I do? How is my certification scheme doing? How is my label doing? How is my program doing? That's the first point. Then to evaluate, as per the consumer in the Green Transition Directive, the one that was presented by Benedicte and which is already final, and then to compare with the upcoming Green Claim Directive that is today in evolution, although we know the big chunk, a lot of chunk of the requirement are not being discussed anymore. And once you have made your evaluation there regarding your verification process, protocols, your governance, anything, then you create a compliance roadmap. Just this exercise can take much more than 6 months to do it thoroughly, to evaluate exactly. And at the end of the journey, you just have a roadmap. So then you have to unpack your roadmap. And this is something that can take years. Because we just mentioned that the labeling scheme has to be, for instance, there is also provision to say that the labeling scheme has to be independent from the traders. Sometimes it's customary to have brands or other organizations within the labeling scheme to ensure that what they do is also relevant. This type of practice will be changed. That means that some people have to change their board, their governance, or other processes like that. That takes a lot of time to be able to do. So you have to change the governance. You may have to change how you do your marketing, in the sense that under which circumstances people are allowed to use your label, how does that work, what is all of the caveat around it. You have to change the comms plan, you have to change the look and feel of the label. We talked quickly earlier that there is an element to say that you should not say green in the future, but there is also provision to say you should not use a leaf. And again, this is one of the provisions upon which Booking.com has been already challenged, because they were using a leaf, which is a normal practice, but how many labels have a leaf in their logo? I leave the question unanswered now. So therefore, coming back to marketing practices have been changed, legal developments have to carry on, legal case has to be monitored, because one thing, and oh, sorry, I'm over time, but just, okay, good. So one thing to keep in mind is that, for instance, now I lost my track, sorry, legal case monitoring, is that the European Commission has decided not to be too directive in how you should calculate your carbon footprint or anything like that. One argument is to say, that's good, you have more freedom. Indeed, to some extent. But that means virtually every judge in Europe could take a decision about, I don't really agree on that. And having followed some cases, sometimes the issue comes down to the simulation of a particular practice, which is extremely detailed in the data set. So therefore, that means that there is a lot of freedom given in the sense that it will be very important to follow how judges are interpreting the legislation, to be agile, to be able to modify things. So that has also to be part of the plan. And then the most important things, the compliance requirement will very often have to be updated to again reflect on, do we evaluate the most impact categories? Are we taking care of the most relevant one? How do we monitor the performance of the one that we want to stamp as being good, etc., etc. So there is an entire implementation phase that will be towards the transition phase. Again, the good news is that you have time. But not time in the sense of, let's wait for the final version, let's wait for, you have time as long as that is anticipated, prepared, and you give yourself the means to be able to deploy that over multiple months, in this case multiple years, to be able to be on path to be ultimately validated. And I finish on one point, because that's for the ones that are today active. Once the law will be passed, if a private operator, even a government, with two different pathways, if let's say tomorrow what was a company the gentleman was working on this morning, the Swedish thingy. Thank you. Visita it was? Imagine Visita tomorrow wants to create a label, Sustainable Sweden, for its best hotel or sustainable accommodation Sweden, because it will be created by a country, or if it's a non-European country, in this case Sweden is, but anyway, then the Commission will have to pre-approve the label before it's allowed to come into play. And then, same thing if it's a private operator. In this case, it will not be the Commission, it will be the member state, but they will have to be pre-approved before being allowed to come to effect, where not only do you have to develop all of the background science, evidence, and all of that, plus you have to demonstrate, as Benedicte mentioned, added value of your effort. And that, there is no little asterisk to say added value is demonstrated by, no. There is a sentence to say you have to demonstrate added values and ... good luck with that. But again, because again the idea here is to say that you should not, they will try to avoid too many labels, too many schemes there, to narrow down the type of information the consumers have, to be able to work better and to have consumers which are more informed. That means that moving forward, and in order to pass to the question time, that there was a question this morning, and I want to come back on that, that was asking why, to which extent certification scheme in the future can be driver of change. It will be very important that in this particular conversation, certification schemes and the label which are given by the certification scheme are just here to inform properly the consumers. The rest could be happening, doesn't mean it should not happen, but it's a very distinct target. So from all of this body of legislation we are talking about, we talk about a way to ensure that the consumers are properly informed and that the consumer can trust the information given. And looking at how active the European Commission and member states have been lately, they really mean to enforce it. On this point, happy to answer some clarifying questions together with Benedicte and to carry on the debate for the coming years.
Thank you, Baptiste. Okay. All right, let's see what we have. By the way, you mentioned when we were chatting here before something you wanted to say about ICL Alliance, I think. No?
No, it's just to say that no, that was okay. Finally, in the speech, that went well. It's just to say that again, keep in mind that sometimes some people could have the impression that there is a lot of schemes which have been developed so far, or there is supra scheme like ICIL or other, who do a tremendous work into supporting already rather robust schemes. But those things are very different from legislation. And it's not because one is ICIL approved that this gives you a green light to be substantiating green claim approved. That the type of requirement that we talk about in ICIL or any other scheme like that versus the type of requirement that we talk about in the Green Claims Directive are vastly different, and that they have to be taken really as distinct operations.
Okay. Let's start with a question from Willy Legrand. Could the EU Green Claims Directive backfire, push companies towards more green hushing or inaction, and fear of doing something wrong, meaning unintended consequences?
Yes. Yes, and it's already happening. Alors, I don't want to do too many name dropping of legislation, but there is a piece of legislation that Benedicte mentioned, which is the ESPR. However, it will not apply to your sector because it's for product. But in product, for instance, the European Commission has more or less the idea, let's say philosophically, the regulation itself was just validated yesterday actually, and now it will be segmented for every product put on the market. The idea is to have more or less a mandated environmental performance for many product category. The way that you know for cars, for television, for fridges, the type of A to E. So the ambition also of the Commission is to take control a bit of this type of element. For services, we will have to see how it will play, but that's part of the equation, that this could be a green hushing, and in some sectors, we already witnessed that.
We have a question from Anonymous. You mentioned...
Wait.
Oh, sorry. Yes, no, thank you very much. I would like maybe also to quickly react to this question, and just also to come back to the scope of the issue we see now, and I can give you just a few data coming from our impact assessment, so the study we carry out before coming with the legislation. But so 61% of the respondents stated that they find it difficult to understand which products are truly environmentally friendly. 44% of the respondents indicated that they do not trust environmental claims. So it's also a bit to insist about the scope of the issue, and that at the end of the day, consumers do not trust anymore and will not look anymore at any claims because they believe they are unreliable. So really the objective is to make sure that when there is a claim, these claims are reliable and that consumers can trust them, and therefore take them into account and act upon this claim. So it's true that probably there will be less claim on the market, but that they will be more robust, and it's what we want to see. Of course, we don't want companies that are truly environmentally friendly not doing any claim, but we believe also by giving a clear framework, at least it will be clear what's allowed, what's not allowed, what are the rules if I want to substantiate my claim, how can I communicate it, and so we believe it will be more legal certainty also to businesses.
Thank you. There was a simple question. You mentioned the word trader. What is the definition of that? That's something that I think not everyone is familiar with.
Do you want to take it, Benedicte?
Certainly. So in consumer law, we indeed use the term traders. It means the business that is in contact with consumers. So we are really always talking about B2C, business to consumer, trader being in contact and reaching out to consumers. I hope that clarified.
Thank you. And I'd like to take also a question from Peter Mag. When can we expect, and perhaps it's for you, Benedicte, when can we expect that certification schemes will be verified by governments?
Sorry, I didn't hear properly. When can we expect? Is that a question of timing?
That certain certification schemes, there was, I think it was you, Baptiste, that mentioned that eventually it will be government that will provide some certain verification and consider them as...
No, I understand. So indeed, So this is not foreseen under general consumer law, but the green claims proposal indeed foresee ex ante verification on all claims and label before they are shown to consumer, put on the market. And this is likely to remain. It will mean indeed, so what's foreseen by the proposal is that it will be body accredited by member states. So it's not public authority directly, but they would need to be accredited.
Okay, so accreditation by a national accreditation body.
And by when do you think it will be happening? So the current timeline that you are working on, Benedicte, so is it that the law will be validated in 25 and that the implementation will be around 27, 28?
Yes, so it's a bit hard to predict at this stage because transposition period and application are also part of the negotiation between the co-legislator. But so we do expect indeed to have a final text in beginning of 2025. It's a directive, so it will need to be transposed by member states. Maybe, let's say, 2 years of transposition, then
27.
before it's entering into application, possibly an additional period.
Thank you. 2 questions here that are a little bit quick for me to answer. As mentioned, questions related to GSTC we will skip here. We'll use the time more appropriately to have with our 2 appreciated speakers. And yes, the slides will be available afterwards. Let's see another nice questions here. Could a company mission statement could be impacted also by the Green Claims Directive? For example, travel with purpose or some kind of like a theme, something like that, that is not necessarily a statement, but it's kind of part of a brand that is being used, like travel with purpose or travel with us for more impact. Would that be something that would also be considered as being affected?
So the definition of environmental claim, it's quite broad indeed. So in general, at least as covered by the UCPD, it might be very broad, and as mentioned, it can be symbol as well. As long as it's for consumer, it will be considered as an environmental claim. Then for the green claims, it targets specific claims, so in general claims in written form that are quite specific, but a mission could be if it's used in communication towards consumer and to, yes, indeed.
And I want to complement that also because the problem that when you start to work in those type of files is that then you see a lot of things from the green claim perspective. And we talk here about the statement a brand can make, so attached to its name. Sometimes we come back on, even this morning on the slide, you had a lot of carbon zero by some time, to be a natural positive by 2030, to be all of these types of things in the future. To come back on one point, if you were to make such a claim, you need to demonstrate the pathway. You need to have financed the pathway, or at least to have finance plan for the pathway. Your testament has to be verified. So all of the points that have been to create the pathway have to be verified. So that means that many of the statements, to come back on the greenwashing question also that we see today, a lot will vanish. How many companies will say they will be net zero by 2030 or 2040 have actually a pathway of reduction with budget that they can verify to demonstrate the accuracy of their pathway? So it's very important that indeed, to this point, it's not purely on the label. Here we took the angle to talk a lot because of the conversation today of certification schemes and label, but it's any type of communication which is ultimately geared toward the consumers.
Let's take a question from Isabel, listener. Let me rephrase it a little bit. So we've mostly talked about the environmental aspect, but when we speak about sustainability, especially in the 4 pillars of the GSTC criteria and in general in tourism and in other sectors, it also includes issues related to social aspects, cultural aspects, and that has not been discussed here, which is a little bit more difficult to measure.
I will give a first answer, but then I will wait for Benedicte to answer on the other point. Because there is 2 things. There is a law which is called Consumer Empowerment, on which there is some elements about social. And this law is complemented by the substantiating Green Claims Directive. So by default, all what I said on the Green Claims Directive is about green. There is nothing, not a single provision there to talk about social, simply because it's not the scope of the substantiating Green Claim Directive. And also because, to your point, when there is conversation today I talked earlier about the key impacts you have to measure to make a claim. There is actually an official list of the 16 impact category that one has to review to be able to check if you tackle the most important impact. Anyway, that's process. But there is nothing equivalent on social. So there is also recognizing that the science is not yet at this level, that it was complicated to create a couple of elements to be able to be more demanding and more directive towards what does it mean to be, if you want to communicate on the social performance of a service. But Benedicte, I'm happy to leave you to complement the answer.
Yes, thank you. So indeed, it's a very good question and a very good point. So the green claims, it's indeed about environment. It has a scope limited to environmental impact aspect characteristics. The empowering consumer for the green transition is broader. So you do have some provision where we refer to environment and social aspect, and there were somewhere we are even broader. So I don't know if you remember the slide, and it's on sustainability label. So it's cover all sustainability label.
We have a few similar questions from colleagues in North America. If you could, perhaps last comment from both of you before we go into the break, on can you expand a little bit on the extraterritorial impacts for companies and organizations that making claims from abroad, outside of the European Union, to European consumer?
In very short, the place where you are based, it's irrelevant in this conversation. The moment you address or that you target to address European consumer, you will be subject to the same claim. If you create whatever firewall to prevent your claim to ever enter the EU market, that's a very different conversation. But it's not, there is no provision to say based on where you are headquartered, based on where the conversation starts. In any case, you have to submit to it. The only case where there is today a provision of distinction is if the claim is made by an official body, by a third-party member state. So in this case, if the question originates from North America, if it's the US federal government who creates a certain certification scheme, even in such a case, the law will today has a provision, which in my view is not disputed, to say that if the US federal government wants to create a label to recognize the sustainability of their own hotels, and they want this label to go to the European consumer, it will still have to abide by all of the requirements of the Green Claims Directive.
So indeed, we are, as explained at the beginning, we are not changing the way the existing directive operates for the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive. This is already the case today, that indeed when you target EU consumer, you are subject to the consumer protection rule. So, and the green claims is taking exactly the same logic, and so applying the same way when you target EU consumers.
Excellent. Benedicte, Baptiste, thank you so much. Appreciate your time to share this information and get us a little bit prepared for the upcoming years. With that, we will finish our session now. We now have a refreshment break until 4 p.m. and at that time you can go to the other sessions that you have registered and have nice dreams tonight about EU regulations. Excellent.
Thank you.